The year was 1963, and the Arizona sun hung in the sky like a white-hot coin, bleaching the color out of the world. It was a brutal, unforgiving heat, the kind that shimmered off the asphalt and turned the horizon into a dancing, liquid mirage. But on this particular stretch of earth, there was no asphalt. There was only red dust, sagebrush, and a jagged, rocky track that barely qualified as a road. Cutting through this desolation was a machine that looked like it had been dropped from another planet. It was a 1962 Cadillac, black as a raven's wing, coated in a thick layer of desert grit. The engine hummed with a low, powerful growl, a sound of American engineering fighting against the primitive silence of the wilderness. Inside the car, the air was stifling, despite the windows being rolled down. The leather seats were hot enough to burn skin, and the air that rushed in felt like the breath of a furnace. Behind the wheel sat Junie Bird. He was sweating through his white dress shirt, his knuckles white on the steering wheel as he navigated the treacherous ruts and stones. Junie was a creature of the pavement. He knew the geography of Harlem like the back of his hand. Every alley, every rooftop, every basement speakeasy. Here, in this vast, empty expanse of nothingness, he looked like a man adrift at sea. He kept checking the rearview mirror, not for traffic, but for the dust cloud that would signal they were being followed. In the passenger seat sat Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. Even in the sweltering heat, Bumpy looked composed. He had loosened his tie and unbuttoned his collar, but he still wore his suit jacket, draped over his shoulders like a cape. He was staring out the window, his dark eyes scanning the landscape with the same intensity he used to scan a chessboard. To look at him, you wouldn't know that he had just spent a decade in Alcatraz, the most notorious prison in the world. You wouldn't know that he was technically a fugitive, violating the terms of his parole by crossing state lines. Technically, Bumpy was a free man. He had served his time. He had paid his debt to society, or at least the portion the government said he owed. But freedom for a man like Bumpy Johnson was a complicated concept. The Federal Bureau of Investigation didn't care about time served. They cared about control. They had released him with strict instructions. Report immediately to New York. Do not leave the state. Do not associate with known criminals. They wanted him on a leash, a retired king collecting a pension of silence. Bumpy didn't like leashes, and he certainly didn't intend to retire. He needed capital. Harlem was waiting for him, but the landscape back home had changed. The Italians were encroaching, the young dealers were wild, and the streets were hungry. To retake his throne, he needed money, and he needed it fast. There was a debt owed to him in Las Vegas, a significant sum from an arrangement made years ago with the syndicate, back when the desert city was just starting to glitter. Bumpy was going to collect. "I still say this is crazy, boss," Junie muttered, wrestling the steering wheel as the Cadillac bounced over a particularly large rock. "We should be on a plane. We should be sipping champagne in first class, not eating dust in the middle of nowhere." Bumpy didn't turn his head. "A plane has a manifest, Junie. A manifest has names, and names go on lists that land on J. Edgar Hoover's desk before the wheels even touch the ground. We take the plane. We get met at the gate by men in cheap suits who want to send me back to the Rock for a parole violation. So we drive through hell instead," Junie countered, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "We haven't seen a gas station in 3 hours. If we break down out here, the buzzards are going to be picking our bones before anyone finds us." "We won't break down," Bumpy said calmly. "And we aren't driving through hell, Junie. We're driving through history. Look at it." He gestured vaguely at the red mesas rising in the distance. "This land was here before the Dutch, before the British, before the Italians. It doesn't care about the FBI. It doesn't care about parole officers. It's honest." Junie grunted. "It's hot. That's what it is. And it's empty." Bumpy smiled slightly. "Emptiness is good. Emptiness means no eyes. We get to Vegas, we meet with the commission, we get the money, and we turn around. By the time the feds realize I'm not in New York, we'll be back on 125th Street, handing out turkeys." They drove in silence for another 20 miles. The sun began to dip slightly, casting long, distorted shadows across the desert floor. The Cadillac was a black beetle crawling across an endless red carpet. Bumpy's mind was drifting, calculating the moves he would need to make once he got home. He thought about Mamie. He hadn't told her the specifics of this detour. He had told her he had business to attend to, loose ends to tie up before he could truly come home. She had looked at him with those sharp, knowing eyes and kissed him on the cheek. She knew better than to ask. She knew that Bumpy Johnson moved in silence. Suddenly, Bumpy sat up straighter. His eyes narrowed. "Slow down," he said. Junie frowned. "Slow down? Boss, I'm barely doing 40. Any slower and we're parking." "I saw something," Bumpy said, pointing toward a ridge about half a mile off the road they were traveling. "Over there, by that cluster of rocks." Junie squinted through the dusty windshield. "I don't see nothing but rocks and cactus, Bumpy. Probably just a heat shimmer, a mirage." "No," Bumpy said, his voice hardening. "It wasn't a rock. It was straight lines. Nature doesn't make straight lines like that. Pull over." "We can't pull over," Junie protested. "If we stop in this sand, we might get stuck." "Turn the car around, Junie," Bumpy commanded. It wasn't a suggestion. It was the voice of the king of Harlem. Junie sighed, muttered a curse under his breath, and wrestled the heavy steering wheel. The Cadillac groaned as it turned off the hard-packed dirt track and onto the loose sand of the open desert. The tires spun for a terrifying second before finding traction. They crept toward the ridge Bumpy had indicated. As they got closer, the shape became clearer. It stood atop a small rise, silhouetted against the blinding sun. It was wood. 2 large beams of timber lashed together. A cross. But it wasn't just a cross. There was something on it. A shape. A bundle of rags that looked disturbingly human. "Jesus," Junie whispered, the annoyance vanishing from his voice, replaced by a cold dread. Is that a person?" "Keep driving," Bumpy said, his hand instinctively going to the inside pocket of his jacket, checking for the pistol that wasn't there. He was fresh out of prison. He couldn't carry. But Junie could. "Junie, check the glove box." Junie reached over and popped the latch. Inside lay a snub-nose .38 revolver. He grabbed it, placing it on his lap. They pulled the car to a halt about 50 yards from the structure. The silence of the desert rushed back in the moment the engine died, heavy and oppressive. Bumpy opened the door and stepped out. The heat hit him like a physical blow, smelling of sage and dry earth. He ignored it. He walked toward the cross, his polished dress shoes crunching on the gravel. As he got closer, the horror of the scene resolved itself into high definition. It was a girl. She couldn't have been more than 18. Her skin was a deep, rich bronze, her hair black as midnight, though now matted with dust and dried blood. She was wearing a tunic made of deer hide, torn in places. She was tied to the wooden beams with thick, rough hemp rope. Her arms were spread wide, her ankles bound together. Her head hung low, her chin resting on her chest. She wasn't moving. "Is she dead?" Junie asked, coming up behind Bumpy, the gun held loosely at his side. He looked around nervously, scanning the horizon for whoever had done this. Bumpy stepped closer, looking at the ground. He saw tracks, tire tracks, heavy boots, cigarette butts stamped into the pristine sand. "No," Bumpy said, "she's not dead. Look at the chest. It's moving, shallow but moving." He reached up and touched her leg. The skin was burning hot, dry as parchment. She was severely dehydrated. Above her head, carved crudely into the wood of the cross, were words. They weren't religious words. They were words of hate. Pagan scum. And below that, 3 letters that Bumpy Johnson knew all too well. 3 letters that had terrorized his own people for a century, though usually in the deep south, not the far west. KKK. "The Klan?" Junie hissed, seeing the carving. "Out here? I thought they were in Mississippi." "Hate travels, Junie," Bumpy said grimly. "It's like a virus. It goes wherever it thinks it can survive." He looked at the ropes. They were tied tight, cutting into the girl's wrists. Her hands were swollen and purple. This wasn't just a murder attempt. It was torture. It was a ritual. They had left her here to bake to death, to be picked apart by the birds while the sun cooked her alive. They had probably laughed while they did it. "Cut her down," Bumpy ordered. "Boss, we touch this, we get involved," Junie said, his voice tight. "We're 2 black men in the middle of Arizona, standing next to a tied-up girl. If the cops come, if the sheriffs come, they won't ask questions. They'll just shoot." Bumpy turned to Junie. His eyes were darker than the deepest part of the ocean. "I said cut her down! Give me your knife!" Junie hesitated for a fraction of a second, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a switchblade. He flicked it open and handed it to Bumpy. Bumpy stepped up onto the small mound of rocks at the base of the cross to get some height. He grabbed the ropes binding her left wrist. The girl moaned, a dry, cracking sound, but didn't wake up. Bumpy sawed through the hemp. It was thick, tough rope. As the strands snapped, her arm fell limp. He moved to the other side. "Catch her," Bumpy said. He cut the right wrist. The girl's body slumped forward. Junie dropped the gun and caught her, his arms going around her waist to keep her from hitting the rocks. She was light, frail, dried out by the sun. Bumpy hopped down and sliced the ropes at her ankles. Together, they carried her to the Cadillac. The back seat, usually reserved for business meetings and romantic interludes, became a hospital bed. They laid her down. Bumpy grabbed the canteen of water they had brought for the drive. "Slowly," Bumpy cautioned. "Don't choke her." He poured a tiny capful of water and pressed it to her cracked lips. At first, the water just ran down her chin. Then, instinct took over. Her tongue flicked out. She swallowed. She coughed, a dry, hacking sound, and then her eyes flew open. They were dark, terrified eyes. She saw Bumpy, a large black man in a suit, and she screamed. It was a weak, raspy scream, but it was filled with pure panic. She scrambled backward, pressing herself against the leather door panel, curling into a ball. "Easy," Bumpy said, holding his hands up, palms open. His voice was low, the soothing baritone he used to calm down angry captains and frightened debtors. "Easy now. You're safe. We aren't going to hurt you." She stared at him, her chest heaving. She looked at Junie, then at the open door, then at the cross standing in the distance. The realization that she was no longer tied to it seemed to hit her. She slumped slightly, the adrenaline fading into exhaustion. "Water," Bumpy said softly. He offered the cap again. She hesitated, looking at the water like it was gold. Then she lunged for it. She drank greedily, her hand shaking so hard she spilled half of it. Bumpy refilled the cap, then again. "Who did this to you?" Junie asked from the driver's seat, looking back over his shoulder. The girl didn't answer. She was staring at the dashboard, at the expensive interior of the car. She looked at Bumpy's suit. She touched the fabric of the seat, as if trying to understand if she was hallucinating. "Can you speak?" Bumpy asked. "Do you understand me?" She looked at him. "Yes," she croaked. Her voice was like sandpaper. "I understand." "What's your name?" "Kaya," she whispered. "Kaya," Bumpy repeated. "I'm Bumpy. This is Junie. We found you. We took you down." She looked out the window at the endless desert. "They left me," she said, her voice trembling. "The men in the white hoods. They said it was a sacrifice. To the sun." "The clan," Junie muttered, shaking his head. "Sick bastards." "Where is your home, Kaya?" Bumpy asked. "Where do your people live?" She lifted a shaking hand and pointed toward the north, toward a range of jagged mountains that looked purple in the distance. 2 hours, she said. The canyon. "We're taking you home," Bumpy said. He closed the back door, gently. "Boss," Junie said quietly as Bumpy got into the passenger seat. "That's 2 hours the wrong way. Vegas is west. If we go north, we're burning gas we might not have, and we're driving deeper into whatever this is." Bumpy adjusted his jacket. He pulled out a handkerchief and wiped the dust from his hands. "Turn the car north, Junie." "Bumpy, we got business," Junie pressed. "Important business. Millions of dollars business." "Business can wait," Bumpy said, looking in the side mirror at the cross receding in the distance. "Some things you don't walk away from. You don't leave a girl to die in the dirt, and you don't drop her off on the side of the road. We take her home." Junie looked at Bumpy, saw the set of his jaw, and knew the argument was over. He put the Cadillac in gear and turned the wheel north. The drive was grueling. The road disappeared entirely after a few miles, replaced by a series of game trails and dry riverbeds. The Cadillac, built for the smooth avenues of New York City, groaned and protested. The suspension squeaked, the undercarriage scraped against rocks. But Bumpy didn't complain. He sat in the passenger seat, occasionally passing water back to Kaya, watching the terrain change. The flat desert gave way to canyons. Red rock walls rose up around them, towering hundreds of feet into the air. It was a fortress of stone, a place where secrets could be kept, and where outsiders were instantly visible. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and purple, they saw smoke rising in the distance. "That's it," Kaya whispered from the back seat. She was sitting up now, looking stronger, though her eyes were still haunted. "My village." They rounded a bend in the canyon, and the settlement appeared. It wasn't what Bumpy expected. It wasn't teepees or stereotypes. It was a cluster of adobe and wood houses built against the base of the cliff, blending perfectly with the rock. There were horses in a corral, a few old pickup trucks, and a central fire pit where people were gathered. The arrival of the black Cadillac was noticed instantly. Dogs started barking. Children stopped playing and ran to their mothers. And then the men appeared. They didn't come with smiles. They came with rifles. Junie slammed on the brakes as 4 men on horseback blocked the path, while another half-dozen appeared on foot from the rocks, holding hunting rifles and old shotguns. They were Native Americans, their faces weathered by the sun, their expressions hard and hostile. They looked at the luxury car covered in dust, and they saw a threat. "Don't reach for the heater, Junie," Bumpy said calmly. "Keep your hands on the wheel where they can see them." "I'm not reaching for anything," Junie said, his voice tight. "I'm just hoping this glass is bulletproof." Which it ain't. A tall man, clearly a leader, walked up to the driver's side window. He held a Winchester rifle loosely in one hand, but his finger was near the trigger. He had long black hair tied back and scars on his face that spoke of a hard life. "You are lost," the man said. It wasn't a question. "This is sovereign land. Turn around." Bumpy rolled down his window. The man swung the rifle barrel slightly toward Bumpy. "We aren't lost," Bumpy said, his voice projecting that natural authority that had quelled riots and prisons. "We have a passenger." Bumpy turned and nodded to the back seat. Kaya leaned forward into the light. The man's eyes widened. "Kaya?" "Uncle," she whispered. The tension broke like a fever. The man shouted something in his native tongue. The rifles were lowered. The horses were moved. The man ripped open the back door of the Cadillac and pulled Kaya into his arms. She collapsed against him, sobbing. Other women ran forward, wrapping blankets around her, checking her wounds, wailing in a mix of grief and relief. Bumpy and Junie sat in the car, forgotten for a moment. Two aliens in a world they didn't understand. "We should go," Junie said. "We dropped her off. Good deed done. Let's back out of here before they decide we kidnapped her." "Not yet," Bumpy said. He opened his door and stepped out. The reunion quieted down as the tall man turned to face Bumpy. He looked the gangster up and down, the expensive suit, the silk tie, the polished shoes covered in dust. He looked at the car. Then he looked at Bumpy's face. "You found her?" the man asked. "Found her tied to a cross about 40 miles south," Bumpy said. "Dehydrated, sunburned, but alive." The man flinched at the description. His jaw tightened. "The white devils," he spat. "Men in hoods," Bumpy agreed. They carved some words into the wood, seemed to think they were making an offering. The man looked at Kaya, who was being tended to by the women near the fire. He looked back at Bumpy. The hostility was gone, replaced by a weary, heavy gratitude. He extended his hand. "I is called Thomas," the man said. "I am the war chief of this band. You have done a great thing today. You have returned a daughter to her people. We have no money to give you." Bumpy took the hand. The grip was iron. "I didn't do it for money. My name is Bumpy. This is Junie." "Come," Thomas said. "Eat, drink. You cannot drive these canyons in the dark. It is death." Junie looked like he wanted to argue, but Bumpy was already moving. They walked toward the central fire. The tribe parted for them, eyeing them with curiosity. It was a strange tableau. The Harlem crime boss and his enforcer sitting on logs around a fire with Apache descendants in the middle of the Arizona wilderness. They were given tin cups of strong coffee and bowls of a thick, spicy stew. Bumpy ate politely, watching the dynamics of the camp. He saw the poverty, the worn clothes, the thin dogs, but he also saw the pride. It reminded him of Harlem in the 30s, a people pushed into a corner, holding on to their dignity with both hands. Kaya sat near the fire, wrapped in wool. She was speaking softly to Thomas and an older woman, the matriarch of the clan. As she spoke, the mood in the circle grew darker. The men gripped their rifles tighter. The women began to weep softly. Thomas stood up and walked over to where Bumpy was sitting. His face was a mask of fury and grief. "She says she was not the only one," Thomas said. his voice trembling with suppressed rage. Bumpy set his coffee down. "What do you mean?" "The men, the clan, they attacked our foraging party 2 days ago," Thomas explained. "We thought both girls were taken to be killed. We thought they were dead. But Kaya says they kept the other one." "Who?" Bumpy asked. "Her younger sister," Thomas said. "Little Aponi. She is only 12. Kaya says they tied her to the cross to scare her, to break her. But they took Aponi with them. They put her in a truck. They said she was fresh." The implication hung in the air, heavy and sickening. Junie looked at the ground, spitting into the dust. Bumpy's eyes went cold. "Where did they take her?" Bumpy asked. "We know where they hide," Thomas said. "There is an old mining compound, abandoned by the government years ago, about 20 miles east of here. The White Devils have taken it. They have walls, fences, guns." "Why haven't you gone to the police?" Junie asked. Thomas laughed, a bitter, barking sound. "The police? The sheriff in the town nearby is the cousin of the leader of these men. If we go to the police, we get arrested for trespassing. Or worse. We are alone here." "So why haven't you attacked?" Bumpy asked. Thomas looked at his men. There were maybe 15 of them of fighting age. They had old hunting rifles, a few pistols, and bows. "We tried," Thomas said quietly. "Last month. They have machine guns. They have high walls. We lost 3 men just trying to get close. If we attack again, we all die, and they will kill the girl before we even breach the gate." Thomas looked at the fire. "We are warriors, Bumpy, but we are not an army. We are fighting ghosts who have the law on their side." Bumpy stood up. He walked to the edge of the firelight and looked out into the darkness. He thought about his own daughter. He thought about the secret son he had sent away to keep safe. He thought about the predators who preyed on the weak because they thought no one was watching. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a cigar. He lit it, the flame illuminating his face. It was the face of the man who had survived Alcatraz. The face of the man who had buried Dutch Schultz. "Junie," Bumpy said. "Yeah, boss?" Junie stood up, dusting off his pants. "Open the trunk." "The trunk?" Junie blinked. "Boss, the Vegas money isn't in the trunk. It's just the tools." "Open it," Bumpy commanded. He turned back to Thomas. "You say they have machine guns?" "Yes," Thomas said. "And walls?" "Yes." Bumpy took a drag of the cigar and exhaled a cloud of smoke that drifted up into the starry sky. "Walls are just psychological," Bumpy said. "They only work if you respect them. And machine guns only work if you have something to shoot at." Thomas looked at him confused. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Bumpy said, turning to look the war chief in the eye, "that you don't have an army. That's true. But you have something better." "What?" "You have me," Bumpy said. Junie walked back into the circle of light. He had opened the trunk of the Cadillac. In his hands, he carried a long, heavy object wrapped in oilcloth. He unwrapped it, revealing the sleek, deadly form of a Thompson submachine gun. He laid it on the log. Then he went back and brought out 2 pump-action shotguns and a box of grenades that Bumpy had acquired for the negotiations in Vegas, just in case the Italians decided not to pay. The native warriors stared at the weapons. "Junie," Bumpy said, "how far is Vegas?" "About 4 hours west," Junie said. "Call the hotel," Bumpy said. "Tell them we're running late. Tell them the price just went up." "We staying?" Junie asked, though he already knew the answer. He cracked a small smile. "We're staying," Bumpy said. "I don't like bullies, Junie. Never have." Bumpy looked at Thomas. "Gather your men, Thomas. We have a lot of work to do before sunrise. I need to know the layout of that mine. I need to know the guard rotations. And I need to know if your men can shoot as well as they can ride." Thomas looked at the guns, then at Bumpy. A spark of hope, fierce and dangerous, ignited in his eyes. He nodded slowly. "We can shoot," Thomas said. "And we can bleed." "Good," Bumpy said, buttoning his suit jacket, "because by tomorrow night, those men in the white hoods are going to learn a lesson about Harlem hospitality." He walked over to the Cadillac, grabbed a map from the dashboard, and spread it out on the hood of the car. "Come here," Bumpy commanded the warriors. "School is in session." As the Native Americans gathered around the black gangster from New York, the moon rose high over the canyon, illuminating a strange and deadly alliance. The desert was silent, but it was the silence before the storm. The KKK thought they were safe in their compound, surrounded by hate and steel. They thought they were the predators. They didn't know that Bumpy Johnson had just checked into the game. The map spread across the hood of the dusty Cadillac was a patchwork of government survey lines and hand-drawn corrections made by Thomas in charcoal. The moonlight turned the paper into a glowing rectangle in the vast darkness of the canyon, the only source of order in a chaotic world. Around the car, the Apache descendants stood in a tight circle, their faces illuminated by the faint glow of the dying fire and the starlight. They were looking at Bumpy Johnson, not as an outsider, not as a black man from a city they had never seen, but as a war chief from a different tribe. Bumpy traced a line on the map with a manicured finger, a finger that had signed death warrants and authorized million-dollar heroin deals. "The mine has a choke point," Bumpy said, his voice low and raspy, carrying easily in the stillness. "Here, the main gate. It's the only way in for vehicles, which means it's the only way they expect an attack to come from. They're arrogant. They think you're scared. They think you're weak. That arrogance is their wall, but it's also their coffin." Thomas leaned in, the firelight catching the deep scars on his cheek. "They have a tower here," he said, pointing to a smudge on the map. "A machine gun nest. It covers the approach. If we ride in, they cut us down before we get within bow range." "That's why we don't ride in," Bumpy said. He looked at Junie. "Junie, bring the Thompson." Junie Bird stepped forward, hefting the heavy submachine gun. In the context of Harlem, it was a tool of the trade. Here, in the primitive silence of the desert, it looked like a piece of alien technology. "This gun," Bumpy said, addressing the warriors, "fires .45 caliber rounds at a rate of 700 per minute. It's a street sweeper, but it's useless at long range. We need to get Junie close. We need to get him inside that perimeter without a shot being fired." "How?" a young warrior asked. He was holding a compound bow, his knuckles white. Bumpy smiled, a cold, thin expression that didn't reach his eyes. "We give them what they want. They want a victim. They want someone to laugh at, someone to spit on. I'm going to walk up to that gate, alone." A murmur went through the group. Junie shook his head violently. "Boss, no, you ain't doing that. You just got out of Alcatraz. I ain't letting you get shot by some hillbilly in a sheet just to prove a point." "I won't get shot, Junie," Bumpy said calmly, "because you're going to be watching me. Thomas, your men know these rocks. Can you get Junie and 2 others into position on the ridge overlooking the tower without being seen?" Thomas studied the map, then looked at the dark silhouette of the mountains. "We are ghosts in this land," he said simply. "We can get close enough to smell their whiskey." "Good," Bumpy said. "Here is the play. I walk up, I distract them, I make them feel big. While they're busy looking at me, Thomas's archers take out the perimeter guards. Silence is key. When the first arrow flies, Junie, you open up on the tower. You suppress that heavy gun. Once the tower is down, the rest of you come over the wall. We hit them from 3 sides at once. Confusion, speed, violence of action. They won't know if they're fighting a dozen men or an army." He looked around the circle. "But remember one thing. We are there for the girl, a pony. If the shooting starts before we know where she is, they might kill her just to spite us. We hold fire until I give the signal." "What is the signal?" Thomas asked. Bumpy straightened his jacket, buttoning it despite the heat. "You'll know it when you hear it." The preparation took an hour. Under Bumpy's supervision, the warriors checked their weapons. Bumpy showed them how to load the shotguns he had brought, explaining the spread pattern of the buckshot. He handed out the grenades to Thomas, explaining the 4-second fuse. It was a surreal transfer of knowledge, the tactical wisdom of organized crime merging with the guerrilla heritage of the Apache. By 2 a.m., the convoy was moving. They didn't take the Cadillac. The engine was too loud, the profile too conspicuous. They moved on foot and on horseback, navigating the treacherous game trails by moonlight. Bumpy walked with them. His Italian leather shoes were ruined within the first mile, scuffed and torn by the jagged rocks, but he didn't complain. He marched with a steady, rhythmic pace, matching the warriors step for step. The desert at night was a different world. The heat had vanished, replaced by a biting cold that seeped into the bones. The silence was absolute, broken only by the soft thud of hooves on sand and the rustle of sagebrush. Bumpy's mind drifted as they walked. He thought about the clan. He had dealt with racists before, police captains, judges, politicians, but they were usually men who hid their prejudice behind badges or laws. These men, these knights in the desert, were different. They were raw, unfiltered hate. They were men who killed children for sport. Bumpy felt a familiar coldness settling in his chest. It was the same feeling he had before he went to war with Dutch Schultz. It was the shutting down of empathy, the locking away of mercy. Tonight, Bumpy Johnson wasn't a man. He was a force of nature. They reached the perimeter of the mine just before dawn. The compound sat in a bowl-shaped depression at the base of a cliff. It was an ugly scar on the landscape. Rusted, corrugated iron buildings, piles of mine tailings, and a perimeter fence topped with razor wire. In the center, a large fire was dying down, casting long, flickering shadows against the rock walls. A wooden guard tower stood near the main gate, silhouetted against the lightening sky. Bumpy signaled for the group to stop. He crouched behind a boulder, scanning the layout. It was exactly as Thomas had described, but worse. There were floodlights powered by a generator, sweeping the open ground in front of the gate. "They are awake," Thomas whispered, crouching beside him. "Good," Bumpy said. "Sleepy men make mistakes, but awake men get cocky." He turned to Junie. "Take the West Ridge. Don't fire until I raise my hand. I want that tower gone in the first burst." Junie looked at Bumpy, his eyes filled with worry. "Boss, if they just shoot you—" "They won't," Bumpy said. "Curiosity is a powerful drug. They'll want to know who the hell I am. Go." Junie nodded and vanished into the darkness, followed by 2 warriors carrying the shotguns. Thomas took his archers to the east, moving like smoke among the rocks. Bumpy waited. He checked his watch. 10 minutes. 15. The sky began to turn a bruised purple in the east. The first rays of the sun were about to hit the canyon floor. It was time. Bumpy stood up. He brushed the dust off his suit as best he could. He adjusted his tie. He slicked back his hair. Then he stepped out from behind the boulder and began to walk toward the gate. He walked calmly, his hands visible at his sides. He didn't rush. He didn't sneak. He walked down the center of the dirt road like he was strolling down 7th Avenue on a Sunday morning. The sound of his footsteps was swallowed by the hum of the generator, but his presence was impossible to miss. A shout rang out from the tower. "Hold it! Who goes there?" A spotlight swung around, hitting Bumpy in the face. He didn't flinch. He kept walking, squinting slightly against the glare. "I said hold it, boy!" the voice screamed, laced with a thick, hateful drawl. "Or I'll cut you in half." Bumpy stopped about 20 yards from the gate. He smiled, a wide, disarming smile that showed his teeth. "Good morning," Bumpy shouted, his voice cheerful. "I seem to have taken a wrong turn. I'm looking for the highway to Vegas. My driver got us lost." The guard in the tower leaned over the rail. He was wearing a white hood, though the robe was unbuttoned, revealing a stained undershirt. Other men began to spill out of the buildings, alerted by the shouting. They were a motley crew of ragged men in clan regalia, holding rifles and beer bottles. They gathered at the chain-link gate, staring at the black man in the expensive suit, standing alone in the desert. "Look at this," one of them laughed, spitting tobacco juice onto the ground. "We got us a straggler, a lost sheep." "You are lost, all right, boy," the guard in the tower yelled. "This is private property, white property. You know what we do to your kind out here." "I can imagine," Bumpy said, taking a step closer. "But I'm a reasonable man. I have money. My car broke down a few miles back. If you gentlemen could help me out, maybe give me a ride to a gas station, I'd be happy to pay for your trouble." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a roll of cash, the Vegas bankroll. He held it up. The thick wad of $100 bills caught the light. Greed warred with hate in the eyes of the men at the gate. The leader, a heavy-set man with a red beard who wasn't wearing a hood, pushed his way to the front. He unlocked the gate and swung it open, stepping out with a pump-action shotgun resting on his shoulder. "That's a lot of money for a lost man," the leader sneered. He walked up to Bumpy, towering over him. "Where'd you steal it?" "I didn't steal it," Bumpy said calmly. "I earned it. I'm a businessman." "A businessman," the leader laughed, looking back at his crew. They roared with laughter. "Hear that, boys? He's a businessman, probably selling dope to white kids." The leader turned back to Bumpy, his face inches away. He smelled of stale beer and unwashed sweat. "We don't want your money, boy. We want your skin. We're gonna have ourselves a little party, just like we did with that little Indian girl." Bumpy's smile didn't falter, but his eyes went dead. "The girl," he said softly. "A pony. Is she here?" The leader blinked, surprised that Bumpy knew the name. "Oh, you know her?" "Yeah, she's here. She's in the shed back there. We're saving her for tonight. Maybe we'll put you two together. A double feature." The leader spat directly into Bumpy's face. The glob of saliva hit Bumpy's cheek and slid down to his jaw. Bumpy didn't wipe it away. He didn't recoil. He just looked at the man. "So," Bumpy said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming the voice of the Godfather, "you have the girl, and you have no intention of letting us go." "Let you go?" the leader laughed. "Boy, you're already dead. You just don't know it yet." Bumpy nodded slowly. "I tried," he said, more to himself than to the man. "I offered you money. I offered you a way out. I tried to be civilized." "You talk too much," the leader said, racking the slide of his shotgun. Bumpy smiled again, but this time it was terrifying. "Well, I tried." Bumpy raised his right hand high into the air, palm open. The air split open. From the ridge to the west, the rhythmic thump, thump, thump of the Thompson submachine gun erupted. Junie Bird didn't miss. The first burst tore through the wood of the guard tower, turning it into splinters. The guard in the hood danced a jerky, violent jig as the .45 caliber slugs ripped through him, sending him tumbling over the railing to crash into the dust below. At the exact same moment, a silent rain of death fell from the eastern cliffs. The Apache warriors, hidden among the rocks, released their bowstrings. Arrows, tipped with broadheads sharpened to a razor edge, hissed through the air. 3 men standing by the gate dropped instantly, shafts protruding from their chests before they even heard the sound of the release. Chaos exploded. The leader, standing in front of Bumpy, froze in shock. He turned his head toward the tower, his mouth open. Bumpy didn't hesitate. In one fluid motion, he stepped inside the man's guard, grabbed the barrel of the shotgun with his left hand, and drove the palm of his right hand upward into the man's chin. There was a sickening crack as the man's jaw shattered. Bumpy wrenched the shotgun from his hands, spun it around, and fired. The leader was blasted backward, hitting the dust dead before he landed. "Now!" Bumpy roared. He racked the shotgun and fired again, taking out a Klansman who was raising a rifle. From the rocks, the war cry of the Apache rose up, a terrifying, ululating sound that echoed off the canyon walls. Thomas and his men surged over the perimeter fence, moving like demons. They weren't using the rusty rifles of their ancestors. They were using the modern shotguns Bumpy had given them, firing with devastating effect. The Klansmen were caught in a crossfire. They scrambled for cover, firing wildly into the air. But they were outmatched. They were bullies, used to terrorizing helpless families, not fighting a coordinated military assault. Junie kept the machine guns singing, suppressing anyone who tried to run for the buildings. He walked his fire along the line of trucks, blowing out tires and shattering windshields, cutting off their escape. Bumpy moved through the chaos with a terrifying calmness. He walked toward the shed the leader had pointed to. A man in a hood ran out of a doorway, holding a pistol. Bumpy didn't break stride. He fired from the hip, the buckshot catching the man in the chest and lifting him off his feet. Arrows thudded into wood and flesh around him. The warriors were precise, lethal. They were reclaiming their land with every shot. Bumpy reached the shed. It was padlocked. He stepped back and fired the shotgun at the lock, blowing it apart. He kicked the door open. Inside, huddled in the corner on a pile of dirty blankets, was a small girl. She was barely 12, her eyes wide with terror, her hands tied behind her back. She screamed when she saw Bumpy, expecting another monster. Bumpy dropped the shotgun. He held up his hands. "A pony?" he said gently. "I'm a friend. Kaya sent me. We're going home." The girl stared at him, trembling. Outside, the gunfire was dying down. The KKK compound was silent, save for the groans of the wounded and the crackle of a fire that had started in the main building. Bumpy knelt and untied her. She fell into his arms, sobbing hysterically. He picked her up, wrapping his suit jacket around her small frame to shield her eyes from the carnage outside. He walked out of the shed. The battle was over. It had lasted less than 5 minutes. The ground was littered with white robes stained red. Thomas and his warriors were moving through the compound, securing the surviving Klansmen. They dragged them into the center of the yard, forcing them to their knees. The arrogance was gone from the men in the hoods. They were weeping, begging, pleading for mercy they had never shown anyone else. Junie came running down from the ridge, the Thompson smoking in his hands. He looked at Bumpy, then at the girl in his arms. He let out a long breath. "You okay, boss?" "I'm fine," Bumpy said. "Get the car. We're leaving." Thomas walked up, his face splattered with blood that wasn't his own. He looked at the devastation, then at Bumpy. There was a look of profound respect in his eyes. "The girl?" Thomas asked. "Safe," Bumpy said. "Scared, but safe." Thomas looked at the surviving Klansmen kneeling in the dirt. "What do we do with them?" Bumpy looked at the men. He saw the hate still burning in their eyes, hidden behind the fear. He knew that if he let them live, they would just come back. They would find another girl. They would burn another cross. "This is your land, Thomas," Bumpy said. "Your laws apply here, not mine." Thomas nodded slowly. He understood. "Take the girl," Thomas said to his men. "Take the cars. Burn the rest." Bumpy carried a pony to one of the tribe's trucks that had pulled up to the gate. He handed her gently to one of the women who had come with the war party. As the truck sped away, taking the child back to safety, Bumpy turned to watch the end of the empire of hate. The warriors were pouring gasoline over the buildings. They were piling the clan's robes and paraphernalia into a heap. Thomas lit a torch and threw it. The dry wood and canvas went up with a whoosh, a tower of cleansing fire rising into the morning sky. The surviving Klansmen were loaded into the back of a truck, bound and gagged. Bumpy didn't ask where they were taking them. He knew the desert had deep holes and old mine shafts. He knew that some people simply vanished, swallowed by the land they tried to defile. The sun was fully up now, bathing the scene in golden light. The smoke from the burning compound drifted south, carrying the smell of victory. Bumpy and Junie walked back to where they had left the Cadillac. The car was untouched, a black monolith in the wilderness. Bumpy leaned against the fender, taking a fresh handkerchief from his pocket to wipe the spit from his cheek. He lit a cigar, his hands steady. Thomas rode up on a spotted horse, followed by his warriors. They formed a semicircle around the car. "You fought well," Thomas said. "Like a demon." "I fought like a man who hates bullies," Bumpy corrected. "You saved 2 daughters of our tribe," Thomas said solemnly. "We will never forget this. You are not from this land, Bumpy Johnson. Your home is the city of stone in the east. But you have a home here now." Thomas reached down and handed Bumpy a small leather pouch. "This is sacred tobacco," Thomas said. "Keep it. It protects the traveler." Bumpy took the pouch and placed it in his pocket. "Thank you, Thomas." "Listen to me," Thomas said, his voice dropping low. "We are not rich men. We have no gold. But we know the earth. We know how to move unseen. We know how to strike and vanish. If you ever have a war you cannot win alone, if you ever need ghosts to fight for you, send word. We will come. We owe you a blood debt." Bumpy looked at the warriors. He saw their discipline. He saw their fearlessness. He saw men who could infiltrate a fortress and kill without making a sound. He thought about the Italians back in New York. He thought about the Commission, the men in the high towers who thought they were untouchable because they had armies of button men. The Italians had numbers, they had money, but they didn't have ghosts. A slow smile spread across Bumpy's face. "I appreciate that, Thomas," Bumpy said. "I truly do." "Go in peace," Thomas said. He wheeled his horse around and galloped away, his warriors following him, disappearing into the canyons as if they had never been there. Junie opened the driver's door of the Cadillac. "Boss, we gotta go. That fire is gonna attract every sheriff in the county. We need to be across the state line in an hour." Bumpy nodded. He got into the passenger seat, sinking into the familiar leather. He looked at his ruined shoes and sighed. "Expensive detour," Junie noted, starting the engine. Worth every penny, Bumpy said. As the Cadillac roared to life and turned back toward the main road, Junie glanced at Bumpy. You think they meant it? Junie asked. About coming to help? They meant it, Bumpy said. Apaches don't lie. Well, that's nice and all, Junie said, steering around a pothole, but I don't see how a bunch of guys on horses are going to help us with the Genovese family. We're fighting a war in the city, boss, not the Wild West. Bumpy took a drag of his cigar, watching the smoke swirl against the glass. He thought about the silent arrows. He thought about the snipers on the ridge who had taken out the guards before they could scream. He thought about the psychological terror of an enemy you couldn't see. The Italians relied on noise. They relied on car bombs and shotgun blasts in restaurants. They were loud. They expected their enemies to be loud. Junie, Bumpy said softly, a dangerous glint in his eye. Yeah, boss? I think I might know how we could use their help. Junie looked over, saw the expression on Bumpy's face, and shivered despite the heat. I almost feel sorry for the Italians, Junie muttered. Almost, Bumpy agreed. Drive, Junie. We've got a kingdom to reclaim. The black Cadillac accelerated, leaving a trail of red dust in its wake, speeding toward Las Vegas, toward New York, and toward a war that was about to change the rules forever. The desert fell silent behind them, holding its secrets. The burning remains of the hate compound, the only evidence that the King of Harlem had passed through. Thanks for listening, folks. If you liked that video and want more, be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss any Bumpy Johnson stories.